Our disability is our greatest strength. It gives us the supervision to see the issues facing humanity from a more inclusive perspective and the grit to fight back against all odds. Welcome to Super Adaptables, the More Than Walking Video podcast discussion. Welcome to Super Adaptables, the podcast where people of all abilities gather to discuss pressing issues that affect the disability community and their implications for the world at large. We're your hosts. I'm Corey Pheez, C4 complete quadriplegic since 2005.
And I'm Jonathan Sigworth, C7 complete quadriplegic since 2006, both of us hailing from the great state of Connecticut.
Yes, sir. We are recording this on Thursday, the 5th of June, 2025, and in a little bit, we'll be discussing accessible and affordable housing. There's no place like home.
Definitely no place like home. And just as a reminder, Super Adaptables is made possible in part by a grant from the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation's National Paralysis Resource Center. The information provided and opinions expressed in these podcasts do not necessarily reflect the views of the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. For more information about the Foundation's National Paralysis Resource Center, visit www.christopherreeve.org. Also, I should note that the views expressed on this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of More Than Walking either, but belong to us as individual speakers.
Indeed. So, The Wizard of Oz is an American movie classic. It's the story that tells the tale of a young woman named Dorothy and her dog Toto, who were swept away by a tornado and magically transported to the land of Oz, where she embarks on a journey accompanied by a scarecrow, a tin man, and a cowardly lion. Dorothy desperately wants to return to her aunt and uncle who are in Kansas.
As many of us know, the story ends with Dorothy learning that with the simple 3 clicks of her red ruby shoes and saying one of the most famous lines ever written, "There's no place like home," she was instantly brought back to Kansas, where she awakens in her bed and then recalls her experiences to her aunt.
Such a beautiful conclusion. And when I think about the setting being in Kansas, that state is one of several located in the American heartland. And there's a proverbial saying, home is where the heart is. And like Dorothy, many of us long for that special place of refuge where we feel at peace, safe, and comfortable. Unfortunately, millions of Americans' stories don't end with a cozy bed, but many find themselves not saying there's no place like home, but rather there's no place to go.
Unfortunately, it's so true, Corey. And according to the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, in January 2022, the total number of people experiencing homelessness on a single night was 582,462 in the wealthiest country on earth. Though the government desires to reduce this number, there has been a steady rise in the amount of people unable to receive adequate housing.
Yeah, that is, jarring when you think about,
It's 500,000.
Right. Like in one of the wealthiest countries on earth. It makes me think about, so a couple of weeks ago, I sat there and watched the History Channel and they talked about Sitting Bull, right? And if anybody understands or remembers who Sitting Bull was, he was one of the great Indian chiefs of the Lakota tribe, which was based around in the Oregon Territory. And their issue was just this spread of colonization and taking away homes for Native Americans. And eventually Sitting Bull succumbed and, end up living on a reservation, right? So they had all of this land where their people was able to migrate to and fro. And now they're just reserved to just a piece of land that the government issued to them so that they could be able to thrive. Not only him, but it was also Crazy Horse, another famous Native American leader. And so, long story short, Sitting Bull ended up going on a kind of tour of sorts with Wild Buffalo Bill. And he goes to places like New York, all over through the continental United States, showcasing just the war between, the settlers and Native Americans. And he ends up coming across homelessness in the inner cities. And he was floored. He could not believe it. He said, wait a minute. These are the same individuals who have taken land, and yet their own people themselves are poor and they're homeless. So, it is a reoccurring theme throughout history, which, we're going to get into a little bit later. But
Hmm.
The Department of Housing and Urban Development defines homelessness as sheltered people who are living in emergency shelters, transitional shelters, safe havens serving people with severe mental illness, or hotels/motels. And unsheltered people who live outdoors in cars in abandoned buildings or in other places unfit for human habitation. And I found this one, John, to be ironic too. People staying with friends are considered homeless if they cannot stay longer than 14 days, which is 2 weeks. And so that's the formal explanation. But more importantly, when did all of this begin?
That's really important to note. Even 14 days is you're jumping from couch to couch. Guess what? You're homeless. So the term homelessness was used in the 1870s to describe tramps, which were individuals who were itinerant workers traveling on foot looking for employment. Ironically, back then, the issue wasn't people without houses, but the concern was the threat to the idea of home life. According to the National Center of Biotechnology Information, one religious group described the problem as a crisis of men let loose from all the habits of domestic life, wandering without aim or home.
Yeah, I thought that was like amazing to think that the threat of people not being in the homes on their individual farms, caring for their family right then and there would be more of the issue than actual people not having a place to go and place to live.
So was it the case that they didn't have a place to go, or was it like there were a whole bunch of migrant workers all staying in hostels and people were freaked out and called that a homelessness issue because they weren't in a domestic setting? Or was it a combination of both? They were homeless, they had no place to sleep, and but people were not freaked out about that. It was they were freaked out about like where's their kitchen? Where's their daily chore routine?
Right. Yeah, it's a bit of a combination of both, but it's more like, all right, as a, let's say you have a family, I don't know, family of four. You are supposed to be confined, essentially working and tilling your land. Your wife is doing what she is doing, maybe gathering and cooking, caring for the children. And the children are following suit because they're working also on the land. But now you go decide, I'm going to go into a bigger city, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. Now you're removing yourself from home. Your family is essentially broken apart. That was more scarier then because now you're kind of messing up the status quo. Sometimes I think about it like, we have in the 50s and 60s women who are homemakers. And then when women search for jobs, they're no longer in the home. Now both parents are working. Now they can't tend to their kids. Now the kids don't have both parents kind of raising them in a setting because the focus more is on work, which then is a snowball effect because it turns into where do we keep all these people who are leaving their homes essentially. So it is a bit of a combination of both, and it seems that nothing that we know ever starts off the way we understand it to be. And I know that the Industrial Revolution and urbanization caused people to leave their farmlands in search of job opportunities where they could earn steady wages. To get around, often young able-bodied men would ride the rails, or in other words, ride on the train without permission. And soon after, in the 1890s, the term hobo was used to describe individuals who were homeless. That influx of people, it led to overcrowding in cities and deplorable conditions in tenement housings. And if anybody in our age group remembers, I think it was Pee Wee's Big Adventure or something like that. Pee Wee Herman ends up jumping on a train with this homeless guy, and they're kind of like living free off the land and stuff like that. So that imagery kind of comes to mind when I think about that.
Living off the grid. Fascinating. So fast forwarding a little bit, in the 1980s, issues such as gentrification, deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill, and people with disabilities, high unemployment rates, and the emergence of HIV and AIDS, lack of affordable housing options, and budget cuts to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, all those things have contributed to the crisis, the homelessness crisis in particular that we have on our hands today.
Yeah, indeed. And you think about it, cuts to these governmental structures, and I think that's part of the fear of what we're experiencing now is that there's a slow movement of claims being processed, people getting the things that they need because the government has laid off, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, right? So, but many of the conditions you mentioned have had a terrible effect on many minority communities, including the disabled community. In the brief history of homelessness that we mentioned earlier, there was a disproportionate amount of white males, 50 years and older, who made up the majority of the homeless population. So I thought that was ironic too, because when we think about communities that are affected, we typically think about, Black and brown communities. But at one point, it was actually Caucasian people who made up the bulk of it, right? So, these turn of events, when they change, I think sometimes we miss out on the fact of realizing this just didn't start off this way, and we just really need to correct course. And so, sorry, go ahead.
Although I wonder how much of that is because of discrimination in hiring.
Mm,
They weren't exactly hiring many black males or many women for those jobs, so I'm sure that had something to do with it.
yeah, I think you're spot on. And so, like, driving around because we don't live that far from the capital. Um, Many of the projects that were erected, for example, Westbrook Village, where I lived for a short period of time, it was constructed in the 40s and 50s. So we're talking about like post World War II. Um, but there was such an influx of people also like migrating from the South. My relatives did the same thing. They left Virginia, where they were planters and farmers, and they moved to places like Philadelphia and went from Philadelphia to Hartford to try to get better job opportunities because there were none in the South. But now those same projects became dilapidated through crime, drug usage, et cetera. Now they're demolished and they're replaced by newer units. And many of the residents have to be relocated as a result. So the issues that occurred in the 80s, especially when crack flooded the inner cities and stuff, have turned, places that were designed to house more people. Um, it's just become more of an issue. And now those places don't even exist anymore.
Hmm. Wow. I mean, we don't even get into the issue of redlining districts where, the growth of suburbia America was limited to mostly white families, and you couldn't get a mortgage or you couldn't get a house if you were an African American or another minority group, and the only place that you could get a house in was the crappiest part of town with the most pollution, closest to the highways. And even then, like when highways were being built, they weren't being constructed through white suburban neighborhoods. They were plowed right through black and brown communities, straight down the middle. So your value goes down. I mean, you wonder why these places become, drug infested areas at that time. There's there's a context there, that has to do with the breaking apart of communities and the denial of opportunities. Um,
Right.
but absolutely, I mean, we mentioned earlier about deinstitutionalization of people, and what comes to mind is, individuals with disabilities, um, being released out into the community, but not having a secure and safe place to live independently. Throughout our previous podcasts, we focused our attention on accessible design, more or less, or simply, people with disabilities being kept in mind when creating housing or creating, these systems of support. And often we are an afterthought. And the notion that someone who looks like Corey and me is unable to find suitable and accessible housing is very frustrating. Um, I'm talking to people on a regular basis who have new spinal cord injuries and they're in the hospital and they're like, I don't know where I'm going to go home. My home is inaccessible. Um, and like in the back of my mind, I know there's options like Section 8, public housing, these things, but the wait lists are so long. And oftentimes these lists are like, you can't even get on them. The wait list is so long. Like you have to wait 2 years in order to simply apply for one of these programs. So there's a real need for accessible housing and programs that facilitate that. But Corey, as a homeowner, what steps did you take to receive adequate housing after your injury?
Yeah. Going back to what you said too before I answer that wait list, it's like you think about it, right? I read this article. It was on, no, it wasn't on CNBC. It was a YouTube short, and this young lady who looked like she had mobility issues. She said, one of the keys is to start early in applying for housing in terms of accessibility and stuff. And she started at 18, and you think, she had to wait 5 years. So it's 23. We're already not only vulnerable, but we also have like our share of, you know, medical issues too, right? We don't necessarily have 5 years to wait for housing. We don't have time to stay in our wheelchair all day because we don't have a place to rest. In fact, this woman who was wrongfully evicted, um, and she couldn't get into a shelter because she was already receiving services. She had to retain some legal services in order to get into the shelter. She said, and this was in the CNBC article, that she spent a year sleeping in a power chair.
Wow.
If anybody has ever had to sleep in a power chair, it is no joke. It is no joke. Like I've slept in my chair for 24 hours before.
It's not that comfortable.
It is not comfortable. And then you have to wake up to make sure you do pressure releases and trying to weight shift if you can. Those things they're hard. And I don't think people who are building houses, I don't know how much they consider those kind of hurdles and gymnastics. Essentially, we have to flip through in order to just be able to say, listen, I want a home. My experience was vastly different from everyone. So when I started looking for my first home, which was in 2007, 2006, 2007, I spent a lot of time just figuring out what do I need? How much cash on hand do I have to save up? Because I watched a lot of programming that allowed me to understand, this is what it takes to be a homeowner. But then
But Corey, before you got to a home, where were you staying after the
I
hospital?
was with my parents
Okay.
in the living room,
Yep. Been there.
you know,
That's it. The living
twin size,
room.
twin size bed, a whole bunch of boxes and supplies. And, just all I could do is traverse the living room, dining
Bathroom.
room, barely. I couldn't even get to the bathroom. Inaccessible.
What did they have to do to get you in the house?
Oh my gosh. So thank God for the military. That was one of the things that kept me in the hospital longer. They had to put a ramp in front of my parents' house, and it was an elaborate ramp. It wasn't just something that, okay, they got 5 steps, and then you just create a steep ramp, and then you can go up. And no, it you had to drive up. It's like to the left of my parents' driveway. Drive up, go to one landing, go to another
So you had
landing.
like several crisscrosses. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it was super elaborate. So yeah, that was the only way to
Okay.
get at my parents' house. Couldn't get out the back door either.
So
So
parents' house, living room, bedroom, kitchen,
yeah,
bathroom, barely.
not even
Finally, not
actually,
even. No.
not even. But then yeah, so I got with my realtor. She found a number of places, found a condo, um, and then 2 other homes. The condo was just on the on like at the bottom level, no kind of elevator. But the issue too was where you got off onto the sidewalk, you had to go through grass to be able to get to the sidewalk that led into the condo. So you think about it, if it snows and it's 2 feet of snow, somebody has to cut a path for you. You can't you can't get to the condo. And then it was narrow, like looking into the condo, I ended up ripping a hole in the wall, reversing down the hall. So then I had to go pay for these people's wall to get fixed. And
That wasn't a long-term issue. That wasn't
no,
a
no, no,
long-term solution. No.
no, it definitely wasn't. And then the next house had an elevator in it, which was neat. But then the elevator only had like a 400-pound capacity. And I'm already 250. my chair is 430 pounds.
So
So
no
that was
no restaurants on the weekends. Nope.
no, no, none of that stuff. And then the last house had a ramp and it was pretty accessible, but it was going to take some more modifications. But thankfully, at the end of the day, found a house that the occupant at the time, he happened to have no legs, so he was in a wheelchair, and his wife was a quadriplegic before she had passed, and so the house was already modified to a certain extent, and I just had to add other things to it, and so that helped me because that house was already prepped by the grace of God, and then I also went through CHFA, which is Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, CHFA. They can help with financing. They offer 30-year fixed rate mortgages, which that's what you want, with below market interest rates to low to moderate income families and individuals in Connecticut. So that was pretty much my journey in a nutshell. But how about you?
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Realizing, thinking about this, I went home to the hospital, uh, to a downstairs bedroom in my parents' house. They just had to widen one. They made it. They took out a closet to the bathroom that was next door, turned it into a little hallway with an extra door. So I had access to the bathroom and the ground floor. Um, and they just put in a cheap ramp, like 40 degrees, straight into the house because they were like, I wanted to go back and forth to India. Um, and so because that's where I was injured and we were doing annual trips back to kind of volunteer and things. So to save money for those trips, we decided not to modify the house for my long-term use, because I knew I was going to college. So basically, I got out of rehab in the spring, spent the summer at home, and in the fall, I had accessible housing, freshman dormitory at Wesleyan. So for the first 8 years, because that's how long it took for me to finish my undergrad, um, I was living in college dormitory. So that was my accessible housing, more or less.
Wow.
Um, which, looking back on it, was really fortunate because when I graduated and I moved to India for a year and then I moved back, I don't remember, but at some point, I'm sure I got myself on the public housing wait list. Um, and so I had some lag time. But again, I think I went from being in college, being in India, then back home in my parents' living room. I think while I was waiting for the wait list, and then I finally got public housing in New Haven,
Mm,
um, where I lived for several, probably a few months. Um, then ended up then got married. I must have lived there for a year and then got married, and then lived there with my wife, before we found our own apartment, elsewhere in Bridgeport, and then our first home here in Stratford.
wow.
But uh, being on the public housing experience was really eye opening because I think like I was the only white person in that building,
Yeah.
which was interesting, and there were just a few wheelchair users, just a couple wheelchair users, um, but also realizing that like I needed this help, I needed this support. Like on my own, I had no money, right? Even though I had graduated college, I had no income. Um, my family had resources, but personally, I did not. And if I wanted to live independently, like this was the route I had to go, was living in public housing. And that was interesting. And I think it just broadened my perspective of how broken the system was because, you look at, nursing homes or retirement communities, they're mostly white, elderly folk, and they have nursing care, caregiving, etc.
Mm,
People in these public housing, they had dementia, they had they needed 24-hour nursing care and they were living alone, and I remember a neighbor asking Jessica for, if she could help. grab something out of the cupboard, and Jessica opened the cupboard, and there was just cockroaches crawling everywhere, and this lady was half blind, and she was like reaching for a teacup. And we're like, what is this? Like, this is the state of public housing
Yeah.
in one of the largest cities, in one of the wealthiest states, in the wealthiest country on earth, Connecticut, New Haven, right? Like, what is going on? How is this public housing? So it was impossible. So yeah. So and forget getting on Section 8, that waiting list, for accessible non-public housing options. You can't even get on that list. It's years
Yeah.
and years and years and years because there's so many people taking advantage of that.
That's what leads to, you know, like roaches and what have you. They don't just come out of nowhere, right? They usually, I joke and say about it, just, having experience and stuff with that. It's like they're hitchhikers, right? All it takes is for somebody come to your house with a bag. Let's say it's a relative. Maybe your relative is on a wait list but has nowhere to go. And then they come into your home and then like they need to stay there for a couple weeks or whatever like that. They may carry the roaches with them to your home and then boom, you have an infestation. That's usually how it happens. I had an aunt, that entire apartment complex. I don't know if it's still there, but it should have been condemned because it was like everywhere, everywhere. I wanted to ask you, um, how, because we talk about like the housing market here in America, but it's really a global issue. How was it returning back to India and finding adequate and accessible lodging there? What was that like?
Oh, this is funny. Oh, this goes. Um, so when I graduated college and I went to India, we got an apartment. The foundation we helped start got an apartment and a ground floor. In India they have little ramps, but like they're for your motorcycle, so they're like 45-degree things for like rolling a two-wheeler up into your front little courtyard thing. People don't have yards really in Delhi. Uh, so very, very compact housing. But for our apartment in what was the Kailash colony was the area in Delhi. We had to put in a cement ramp, basically convert the space that was designed for like the parking place for our apartment. We converted that into a wheelchair ramp. And when we did that, the neighbors got upset because their SUVs had less room to drive on the road because our wheelchair ramp was getting in the way, which it wasn't, but it just made it a little challenging to drive because the roads are so narrow. Um, so at one point, I think there was like a small gathering of neighbors protesting our wheelchair ramp um, because it was getting in the way of their Scorpio SUVs, which was just insane.
Wow.
Um, but no, accessible housing is it's not a thing. You have to build everything, and the majority of the people staying in the transitional living apartment that we were running were coming from homes um, that were completely inaccessible, and they had spent on average about 7 years living on that second, third, fourth floor
Mm.
because there was no way out except being carried up and down. So it's quite difficult. So not only you have the physical inaccessibility, but of course there's the social isolation, and that's why whenever we would roll down the street, everyone would just stare at us because it's like, where are all the wheelchair users? Well,
Yeah,
they're
you're free.
upstairs.
You're free. You're supposed to be in your apartment.
They're upstairs.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. And that's an issue because again, like going back a little bit to the accessible design, right? Like sometimes contractors, they kind of do like the bare minimum. And one of the complaints I've read about is that, okay, there's an elevator in the building, but then if the elevator needs maintenance, what then happens? And I think back to my aunt. My aunt had multiple sclerosis and she was morbidly obese, right? So it's like if the elevator didn't work, she'd have to take the stairs. And I've seen her personally fall, right? Like she's 300 pounds, falling, and even access into her building, you had to go down a steep set of stairs, right? I look back at that now that I have mobility issues and not able to transition from one spot to the next, and it just should be simplified. It's very aggravating to know that I am just relegated to being some second class citizen. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't people out there trying to make the changes, but again, you're making these changes, you know, after you've already made the construction. And how do we get our voice as a part of these discussions, right? Like, we talked about programs and stuff, being on waiting lists for housing authority. And just for the simple fact that you have to be on a waiting list tells me the congestion is so real. Whereas if you're looking for a home and you have the money and the resources, you don't really wait. You secure a loan, you find a home that you feel is good, suitable for you and your family, and then you just worry about closing costs afterwards, and then boom, you're in there. Whereas the rest of us have to not only worry about the cost of the home, but also what it may cost to renovate, which I know we'll talk about in our later discussions down the line. So essentially, without programs to help subsidize costs for things like those renovations, tax breaks, grants, and other types of financial assistance, people with disabilities can't afford housing and are left with fewer options than our able-bodied counterparts. In an article written in 2023 by Urban Land, many Americans are considered severely rent burdened as they spend more than 50% of their earnings on housing. In addition to that, less than 1% of housing is wheelchair accessible. So I don't know about you, like when I drive around, I always look to see who has a wheelchair ramp in front of their house. And I think about some of the ways before I started purchasing portable ramps, how I would get into other people's houses. I remember buying two by fours and just trying to balance my chair up the two by fours before a ramp was actually constructed out of those two by fours, which it was great, but then the ramp was just bulky, couldn't fold or anything. So then you're just left with staying in one place indefinitely sometimes.
In places in Europe and elsewhere where they have universal healthcare programs, you get injured, they pay for the modifications to your home. They pay for a ramp, they pay for a lift. Like, this is not something that you have to fundraise for or like figure out. And it is so insane that I'm talking with a 19-year-old down in DC, in our country's capital, who is home, single mother, trying to make things work.
Yeah.
This person's also struggling with mental illness and a spinal cord injury and finishing high school remotely and cannot get out of his house because there's no ramp
Yep.
and doesn't even know where to start. And ramp quotes that they're being given is like $20,000, $30,000. A lift brand new, same amount. It's just like, how is this not something that our governments, our representatives are planning for? Like, this should not be an exceptional circumstance. This should be what we expect to happen, and maybe a long-term investment to like, hey, let's at least subsidize these home modifications because you're retrofitting a living environment to make it accessible for the next occupant. And it doesn't make sense that these are considered exceptional needs when they are universal needs at any point, and at some point down the line. So it's frustrating. It's also, I mentioned, the racial element to the makeup of the public housing, because it's, these are not seen as high priorities if the majority of our representatives do not look like those who are stuck in these programs, right? Like, this is why representation matters. This is why we need representatives from all aspects of our community, all minority groups who have personal connections to these issues. Because otherwise, people just forget and they don't care, and they don't see that this is the result of systematic racism, systematic uh, programs that are designed to impoverish or to keep impoverished. I mean, just there's so many intersections where you're stuck on an insurance that forces you to be poor. Therefore, your only place that you can afford to live is public housing, alongside other people who are forced to be poor. And you're aging. So, like, you can't take care of yourself. So, you can't take care of your home environment. And it's just a really sad downhill, environment that just keeps getting worse. And unless we really start prioritizing housing along with healthcare as like human rights that can be available to everyone, it's not like this isn't something we need to deserve, right?
Right.
This is something that can pay for itself with the benefits that it brings. Um, but yeah, it's a frustrating thing. So we're going to talk about all the different solutions that are out there and the programs that are there to help people in different states. There's federal programs, there's nonprofits, there's state programs that vary state by state. But we're going to talk with experts later this month about this as well. So it's a frustrating topic, but there is hope and there are resources, and we're going to help explain those and dig deep into those later on.
Indeed, indeed, we are. And I would just end with, you know, it, there are people who are recognizing, you know, just how bad this is getting, and it's a growing problem here in America, and it's been that way. Again, we talked about since the late 1800s. But Peter Thiel, CEO of PayPal, he spoke about just the housing crisis. And he said this, he said the dynamic ends up being that you add 10% to the population in a city, and maybe the houses prices go up 50%. And maybe people's salaries go up, but they don't go up by 50%. And so the GDP grows, but it's a giant windfall to the boomer homeowners and to the landlords. And it's a massive hit to the lower middle class and to young people who can never get on the housing ladder. And I think that really sums it all up, because this is not just in order to even get to affordable housing, you have to have some form of income or saving to be able to put yourselves in a position to get a loan, because the bank is going to want to know how that money is going to be returned. And if housing costs go up, that means there's an increase in taxes. But if your pay is not matching that, you're already struggling with unemployment as a person with a disability, you're going to find yourself back out on the street. And not even just the proverbial like on the streets, but just the way that homelessness is defined. And you may find yourself
Parents' living room.
parents' living room, 2 weeks or more, right? So, but that is what's going on. But man, this was a great discussion, as always, and for everybody who's tuning in and participating in these more than walking discussions, man, we say thank you.
Yes, thank you, and stay tuned. And just want to also mention another issue that we'll kind of try to cover more, I think, is different federal and state laws also affect people with disabilities with housing. So especially like if you have nerve pain and you need to use medical marijuana to treat that, right? That may be illegal in a state, but it's still illegal federally. And so, public housing, which is federally subsidized, you can't have medical marijuana and be in public housing because it's federally subsidized. So literally, like, the medicine that you need to function day to day living with a disability disqualifies you for the only public housing option that may be available to you. And it's just insane. Anyway, one of many things we'll cover later. But stay tuned in and sign up for the More Than Walking newsletter at morethanwalking.com to learn more about this. topic, which we will cover this month, and how you can participate. Also, like, comment, and subscribe to our More Than Walking YouTube channel to watch each podcast, and click that notification bell so you are alerted when new episodes drop. Follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for More Than Walking or Super Adaptables.
Yes, sir. And until then, remain encouraged, stay hopeful, and above all else,
Keep adapting.